What would you do if you were asked to risk your entire career, your entire life, for a man everyone else says is guilty? That is the choice facing rookie officer Grace Turner. A man on death row has 2 weeks to live. But his final wish isn't for himself. It's for his wife. It's a plea that pulls her into a conspiracy that goes all the way to the top. If you believe stories of true courage need to be told, please like this video and subscribe so we can continue to bring these truths to light. Stay with us, because the ending to this story will challenge everything you believe about justice. Inside those concrete walls, death was as ordinary as the breakfast bell. But for Grace Turner, the new correctional officer, something in those words cut deeper than the metal doors slamming shut. That same afternoon, she walked past cell block E and found him, Michael Reed, 57, gray at the temples, sitting upright on his narrow cot, his hands folded like a man in church. The others shouted, cursed, laughed, but not him. He was writing again, small, neat letters on thin paper, each line pressed down with patience. When he looked up, his eyes were steady, tired, and too calm for someone counting his last days. "They said my wife's house got broken into," he murmured. "But I guess that's not in your report." Grace froze. She hadn't spoken a word to him before. No one told her he still had a wife, or that someone might be threatening her. The air felt heavy, like the swamp outside had seeped into her lungs. That night, she couldn't sleep. The sound of the electric fan mixed with the distant rumble of frogs, and the man's voice replayed in her head. "They said my wife's house got broken into." 2 weeks before an execution, inmates were supposed to talk about regrets, prayers, or forgiveness. But Michael Reed spoke only of someone else's safety. It unsettled her. She told herself it wasn't her business. But that quiet tone of his, polite and broken in equal measure, stayed with her like a whisper that wouldn't leave. Grace Turner was 28 years old, and she had never believed in ghosts. Not the kind that haunted houses, at least. But there were other kinds. The ghosts of conscience, of things left undone. She joined the Louisiana Department of Corrections because she believed rules kept people safe. Her father had been a sheriff in Baton Rouge. Honest, strict, the kind of man who polished his badge every Sunday and said, "Law is the backbone of this country, Gracie." He died when she was 19, heart failure after 30 years on duty. She'd worn his badge pinned inside her jacket ever since. Her mother lived 2 towns over, too sick to visit often. Grace sent money every month, skipped vacations, and never married. There had been a man once, Ethan, a paramedic, but she'd chosen her work instead of him. "Someone has to keep the line straight," she used to tell herself. At St. Helena, the line wasn't straight at all. The guards joked about inmates like they were cattle. The warden cut corners. The smell of bleach never covered the stench of sweat and rust. Grace followed every rule she could, trying to keep her father's voice alive in her head. But even the righteous get tired in a crooked place. Michael Reed wasn't supposed to be different. Yet something about him, the way he thanked her for bringing his mail, the way he said ma'am without bitterness, made her hesitate. One afternoon, while checking his cell, she found a photograph tucked beneath his Bible. It was faded, curled at the edges. A young couple standing outside a small wooden house by the bayou, sunlight glinting off the water. On the back, in careful handwriting, it said, "Helen and Michael, summer of '94. Grace turned the photo over again and again. The woman, Helen, smiled like she still believed life was fair. Michael, younger then, held her close as if nothing could break them apart. When he noticed the picture in her hand, he didn't flinch. "She's my wife," he said quietly. Or, she was. His voice cracked on the last word, soft but certain. "I sold our house once, to pay her medical bills. Thought we'd start over when I got out. But I never did. And she never believed I was innocent." For a moment, the prison felt smaller, the walls closer. Grace put the photo back, unsure why her throat burned. Later, she sat alone in the guardroom, staring at the swamp through the bars of the window. The air shimmered above the mud flats, heavy with the scent of decay and wild jasmine. Somewhere far away, a church bell rang. She whispered to no one, "Why does he still care about her?" The older officer beside her laughed. "Because fools die thinking love will save them. You'll learn, rookie." But Grace wasn't so sure. Maybe, she thought, love wasn't the foolish part. Maybe giving up was. That night, she opened the prison's public record terminal and typed Michael Reed. Case file, Osher 871 Her heart beat faster as the words, "Convicted of first-degree murder at Dalton and Sons Seafood Factory," appeared on the screen. The rest was a blur. Arguments, missing evidence, a plea deal he never took. Outside, thunder rolled over the bayou. Grace stared at the flickering screen, feeling something shift quietly inside her. She didn't know it yet, but that simple search, the decision to look, would change the rest of her life. The morning light in St. Helena had a way of cutting through the bars like judgment. The swamp mist clung to everything, the walls, the uniforms, even Grace's breath. She tried to focus on her rounds, but her eyes kept drifting towards Cell E. Michael sat the same way every day, his back straight, his Bible open on his knees, as if waiting for a sermon that would never come. When Grace passed, he looked up with that calm, unreadable patience. "Officer Turner," he said softly, "could you make sure this letter gets mailed?" She hesitated, glancing at the envelope. The name written in neat blue ink read, Helen Reed. She shouldn't take inmate mail directly. Protocol required inspection. Yet when she saw the shaking lines of his handwriting, she slipped the envelope into her pocket before her mind caught up. That night, at home, she sat at her small kitchen table, staring at the letter she hadn't mailed. The house was silent except for the ticking of the wall clock. Finally, she opened it. The letter wasn't what she expected. No begging, no anger, just love written like a confession. "Helen, I know you stopped believing me long ago. Maybe you were right to. Maybe I wasn't strong enough to protect what we built. I think about that night at the factory, about the man who died and the things I couldn't prove. I'm not writing for forgiveness. I'm writing so you'll know that I never wanted you to be afraid. If anything happens to you, tell them to look at Earl Dalton. He won't let this end with me." Michael Grace folded the letter carefully, her throat tight. The name Earl Dalton echoed like a warning. She'd heard it before, in training, in whispers. A powerful businessman, known for donating to the local sheriff's campaign. The next morning, she couldn't look Michael in the eye. She returned the envelope, unopened. "It's been mailed," she lied. He nodded, as if he already knew. "You ever notice," he said quietly, "how truth don't travel as fast as lies do?" Grace said nothing, but that line stayed with her through the day, echoing with every sound of the closing gates. 2 days later, while checking the archives for incident reports, Grace stumbled across something odd. The file on Michael Reed, case number 8716, was missing 3 pages. When she asked the records clerk, he shrugged. "Guess they got lost in the flood last year." But she noticed a water stain that stopped right before a signature line. Someone had ripped the pages out, not lost them. That night she returned to the file room alone. The lights hummed above her. Dust floated like ash. In the back cabinet, she found an older box labeled Dalton and Sons, Employee Records 1998-2003. Inside was a photo of Michael with 2 other men. One of them was the factory foreman who died, the same man whose blood had put Michael on death row. The other man was Earl Dalton, his arm around both of them, smiling. Grace felt her pulse quicken. She wasn't a detective. She wasn't supposed to be digging. But something about that picture told her the story wasn't over. The next day, she brought Michael his breakfast tray. "Did you ever meet Dalton outside the factory?" she asked casually. He looked up, surprised. "You shouldn't be asking that." "Maybe not." He studied her face for a long time before answering. Dalton owned the factory, the trucks, the lawyers, the judge's campaign. Everything that mattered. He told me once, "Everyone's replaceable, Reed, even truth." Grace didn't reply, but inside, something twisted, the The same feeling she'd had when her father's heart stopped before the ambulance came. That helplessness, that silence after someone dies and the world keeps turning. That night, she drove out past the parish line, where the swamp gave way to a 2-lane road and an old diner with a flickering neon sign. She met a woman there, Ava Brooks, a local journalist who'd written about corporate scandals. Grace didn't say she worked at the prison, only that she knew something about Dalton. Ava leaned forward, eyes sharp behind her glasses. That man's untouchable. Half the politicians around here owe him favors. Grace lowered her voice. What if there's proof he framed someone? Then you better have more than words. They exchanged numbers in secret. As Grace drove home, headlights followed her in the rearview mirror for miles. When she turned onto her street, the lights vanished. Inside her house, she found muddy footprints near the back door. The lock wasn't broken, just unlocked. She sat on the floor until dawn, the photograph of Michael and Dalton clutched in her hands. The next morning, she returned to the prison looking pale, her uniform pressed, but her hands trembling slightly. Michael noticed. You've seen something, he said. I don't know what I've seen. He nodded slowly. That's how it starts. When she handed him his meal tray, his fingers brushed hers. If you ever meet Helen, he whispered, tell her I'm sorry I wasn't stronger. And tell her not to trust anyone who says they work for Dalton. Grace felt her throat tighten. Why me, Michael? Why tell me any of this? He smiled faintly. Because you still believe the law means something. That's a dangerous kind of faith. She turned to leave, but his words followed her out of the cell, echoing through the corridor long after the doors clanged shut. That night, Grace stood by her window, staring at the swamp. The cicadas screamed in the heat. Somewhere in that darkness, she knew a lie had been told, and she was already part of it. And though she didn't realize it yet, the moment she chose to listen to Michael read was the moment her own faith in the system began to die. The rain came early that week, heavy and thick, turning the gravel roads into rivers of mud. Grace Turner didn't mind the rain. It gave her cover. No one questioned a young officer walking fast through the corridors with her head down. No one saw what she slipped into her bag, the photocopy of a missing report from Michael Reed's case file. The report wasn't much, just 2 typed pages dated 12 years ago, signed by a man named Peter Lang, a night security guard at Dalton & Sons. It described a fight on the factory floor. But the statement ended abruptly, halfway through a sentence. The last line read, Mr. Dalton arrived before the police told me to. Then the paper was torn. Grace stared at the words until the ink blurred. Dalton had been there that night, the night of the killing. But the court transcripts never mentioned him. The next day, she asked around the prison quietly. One of the older guards, Jim Carter, had worked in the parish for decades. When she mentioned the Dalton factory, he stopped eating mid-bite. Best not to dig into that, Turner, he warned. People who ask questions about Dalton end up unemployed or gone. I just want the truth, she said. He gave a dry laugh. Truth doesn't pay the mortgage around here. That night, Grace couldn't shake the feeling that someone was following her again. A car idled across the street from her house, lights off, engine humming. When she stepped outside, it rolled away slowly, tires whispering against the wet asphalt. She sat by her kitchen window until dawn, watching the mist drift over the bayou. Her father's old badge lay on the table beside her. She thought of what he used to say. The line only means something if you keep it straight. But what if the line itself was bent before she even started walking it? At the prison, she started noticing small things. A key ring out of place. A logbook rewritten in someone else's handwriting. One afternoon, she walked into the storage room for evidence access forms and found the box marked Reed missing. When she asked the warden, he frowned. You shouldn't be looking for things that aren't your responsibility. Sir, that box contained... I said, leave it, Officer Turner. We have procedures for a reason. Procedures. That word, once her anchor, now sounded like a chain. Later that week, She met Ava Brooks again at the diner off Route 65. Ava brought her coffee and a manila envelope. "I looked into that guard, Peter Lang," she said. "He disappeared in 2011. No forwarding address, no death certificate, nothing." Grace felt her stomach drop. "You think Dalton?" "I don't think," Ava said. "I report. But if you want my advice, keep a copy of everything somewhere safe. People in this parish have a habit of losing what matters." Grace nodded, her fingers tightening around the envelope. Inside were newspaper clippings, headlines about Dalton's donations to local law enforcement, campaign photos with smiling sheriffs and judges. The same faces who'd signed Michael Reed's conviction. "Why are you helping me?" Grace asked. Ava smiled faintly. "Because I used to believe in the system too. Then I saw what it did to people like you." Back at St. Helena, Michael seemed weaker. His beard had grown out, gray and thin. "You've been busy," he said quietly when she brought his tray. "You don't know that." He smiled, but his eyes held a strange sadness. "You don't get circles under your eyes from sleeping well, Officer Turner." Grace hesitated, then asked, "Why didn't you fight harder at your trial?" Michael looked past her, toward the window barred against the sun. "Because my lawyer told me the verdict was already written. Said Dalton had friends on the jury. Said the only thing I could do was keep my mouth shut and pray for mercy." He rubbed his hands together slowly, like a man trying to remember warmth. "Helen believed them. She thought I did it. She packed a bag and left before sentencing." "I saw your letter," Grace said softly. "You still care about her?" "She's all I ever cared about," he answered. "But she's not safe. Dalton doesn't forgive the living, and he doesn't forget the dead." Grace swallowed hard. "What does that mean?" Michael looked up at her, his voice low. "It means he's not done yet. And if you keep digging, he'll come for you too." The lights flickered overhead, a low hum echoing through the hall. For a moment, neither of them spoke. That evening, Grace stopped by the prison archive again. The door was unlocked. Inside, the shelves looked the same, until she noticed one new thing. A single silver lighter lying on the desk, engraved with the letters ED. Her hands trembled. The same lighter that had been logged as evidence 12 years ago. Someone had placed it there, deliberately. She reached for it, then froze. Footsteps echoed down the corridor. Heavy boots, male voices. She slipped the lighter into her pocket and stepped into the shadows behind the filing cabinets. 2 guards entered, talking low. "Warden says she's asking too many questions," one muttered. "Yeah," the other replied. "He's getting calls from Baton Rouge, big ones." Their voices faded, but Grace stayed frozen until her knees ached. When she finally made it to her car, her heart was pounding so loud she could barely start the engine. Rain began to fall again, soft, steady, relentless. She drove home, locked the doors, and laid the lighter on the table beside her father's badge. 2 pieces of metal, both symbols of truth. One earned, one corrupted. She stared at them for a long time before whispering into the empty room. "If justice means following orders, then maybe it's time I stopped obeying." Outside, thunder rolled across the swamp. Somewhere deep inside St. Helena prison, a man named Michael Reed waited for a miracle that was already beginning. Quiet, dangerous, and born from a woman who could no longer look away. By the time autumn settled over the Louisiana bayou, the days grew shorter, but the nights seemed endless. Grace Turner had stopped sleeping through them anyway. Every sound made her tense now, the click of a door, the hum of a passing truck, even the distant thunder that rolled over the swamp. She'd begun keeping the ED lighter in her jacket pocket, the metal warm against her hand, as if holding proof could keep her safe. Ava Brooks called one evening. "Grace, you need to see this," she said, her voice tight. "A former Dalton employee just reached out. He's sick, lung cancer, late stage. Says he wants to clear his conscience before he dies." Grace drove 2 hours to Lafayette to meet him. His name was Harold Finch, a thin, trembling man who smelled faintly of medication and smoke. "I remember that night," he rasped. "Dalton was there. He told us to keep quiet. Said the man who died had found out about something. Chemicals, waste being dumped. He said Michael Reed was the easiest one to blame. He coughed so hard Grace thought he might collapse. I signed a false statement. Dalton's lawyers paid my hospital bills for years, but I can't die with this on me. Tell the truth, Officer Turner. She recorded his words on her phone, her hands shaking. When she looked up, his eyes were wet with guilt. You think telling the truth will fix it? He whispered. Grace didn't answer. She sent the audio to Ava that night. If we can verify this, Ava said, it's enough to open an appeal. But we'll need Dalton's financial records, proof of the payments. How do I get that? Ava hesitated. There's one place they'd still keep the originals, his factory office. It's closed now, but the parish sheriff's department stores the remaining files there. Sheriff's department? Grace repeated. You mean the same people who took Dalton's campaign money? Exactly, Ava said. So don't get caught. The following week, Grace waited until the prison night shift. She signed herself out under a false training assignment and drove to the old Dalton & Sons seafood factory, a rusting skeleton against the moonlight. The smell of salt and rot hung in the air. Inside, her flashlight caught rows of metal desks, abandoned papers, and dust so thick it looked like frost. She found a filing cabinet labeled Contracts, 2009. Inside were receipts, payroll lists, and then bank transfer slips marked with Dalton's signature. Payments to Peter Lang, Harold Finch, and 2 other names. She photographed every page with trembling hands. But as she turned to leave, a light flashed outside. A truck pulling up fast. Grace ducked behind the desk. 2 men stepped out, their voices muffled but angry. Boss says someone's been sniffing around again. Probably that reporter, or the prison lady. The beam of a flashlight swept across the windows. Grace's breath caught. She crouched lower, heart hammering. After several minutes, the voices faded, the truck doors slammed, and the engine rumbled away. She waited until silence returned before she dared to move. When she finally stepped outside, the night air smelled of gasoline and rain. She looked back once, the factory looming like a ghost, then drove off into the darkness, gripping the wheel so hard her knuckles turned white. 2 days later, Ava published a story on her independent news site titled, The Dalton Cover-Up, Death, Corruption, and a Man on Death Row. The article included Finch's statement, references to the missing witness, and photos of the payment slips, carefully edited to hide their source. The story spread fast. Local radio picked it up, then state papers. By the end of the week, Baton Rouge officials announced an internal review. Inside the prison, whispers began. The warden called Grace into his office. Turner, he said slowly, someone's been leaking information about a former inmate case. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you? She met his gaze, forcing her voice steady. No, sir. He studied her for a long moment, then leaned back. Good, because if you were, I'd hate to see a promising career end over some dead man story. When she left the office, her hands were trembling again. But this time, not from fear, from anger. That night, she visited Michael's cell. He was sitting by the bars, reading by the dim corridor light. Something's happening, she whispered. People are talking. The truth's coming out. Michael smiled faintly, the lines around his eyes softening. Then you've already done more for me than anyone ever did before. Grace shook her head. It's not over. I found proof, payments, witnesses. They can't ignore this. Michael looked at her, calm as always. You think they care about proof? The people who put me here built their lives on lies. But maybe this time they'll have to see. He reached through the bars, his fingertips brushing hers. You remind me of Helen when we first met. She believed the world could be fixed if you just loved it enough. Grace swallowed the lump in her throat. Where is she now? I don't know, he said quietly. Last I heard, she moved out of state. Started over. But if you ever find her, tell her I never stopped loving her. Later that night, Grace's car alarm went off in the prison parking lot. The windshield was shattered. On the front seat lay a single note, written in block letters, "Stop digging or you'll join him." She stood there in the rain, staring at the words until the ink bled down the page. When she finally drove home, her heart felt hollow. The lighter was gone from her pocket. Someone had taken it. For the first time, Grace understood what Michael meant when he said Dalton wasn't done yet. The next morning, she met Ava behind the diner, the air thick with humidity and fear. "They're watching both of us," Ava said. "But if we quit now, he wins." Grace nodded, her jaw set. "Then we don't quit." In that moment, under the gray Louisiana sky, the young officer who once believed the law was sacred made a silent promise. If the system couldn't deliver justice, she would, even if it cost her everything. The news spread faster than Grace could have imagined. Within days, the small town of St. Helena turned into a storm of headlines and rumors. Some called her brave. Others called her a traitor. But inside the prison, everything went quiet. The guards who used to nod at her now looked away. Michael Reed's name was everywhere. Local radio hosts debated his guilt. Churches prayed for him. But the state refused to delay his execution. Grace hadn't seen him in 2 days. The warden ordered that only senior officers could access death row now. She filed reports, checked inventory, acted normal. But every night, she felt the weight of that missing lighter like a ghost pressing against her chest. Then one afternoon, she got a call from Ava. "Grace, I found her," Ava said. "Helen Reed. She's living near Baton Rouge." Grace didn't hesitate. She drove out of town, the highway stretching through fields of cypress and cane. Rain clouds gathered again. Louisiana never did stay dry for long. Helen Reed lived in a small wooden house near the edge of a magnolia grove. When Grace knocked, a woman in her 50s opened the door. Her face was pale and careful, as if she hadn't smiled in years. "I'm sorry to bother you," Grace began. "My name's Grace Turner. I work at St. Helena." Helen's eyes widened at the words, "St. Helena." "Why are you here?" she asked sharply. Grace hesitated. "I know about your husband, and I think you deserve to know what's happening." "I already know," Helen snapped. "He killed a man. He ruined both our lives. Now he's finally paying for it." Grace stepped closer, lowering her voice. "What if he didn't?" Helen froze. Grace pulled a folder from her bag. Copies of the payment slips, Harold Finch's confession, and a photo of the missing lighter engraved E.D. Wood. "I've seen too much to believe he's guilty anymore," Grace said softly. "Dalton set him up. He framed your husband to protect his business. He paid witnesses, buried evidence. And now the truth is coming out." Helen stared at the documents, her lips trembling. "Where did you get this?" "It doesn't matter. What matters is that your husband never stopped loving you. He never stopped worrying about you." Helen sank into a chair, her hands shaking as she turned the pages. "He wrote to me, you know. Letters I never opened. I burned them. I thought I was saving myself." Grace sat across from her. "He didn't blame you." For a long time, neither spoke. The only sound was the soft patter of rain on the roof. Finally, Helen looked up. "If what you're saying is true, then I can't just sit here. What do we do?" Grace exhaled slowly. "We take this to Baton Rouge. We bring it straight to the court." Helen nodded, her eyes wet but steady. "Then we go." They drove through the storm together. Grace at the wheel, headlights cutting through sheets of rain. The folder of evidence sat on the dashboard, lit with each flash of lightning. Helen broke the silence first. "He was a good man, you know. Michael, always trying to fix what wasn't his fault. Maybe that's why I stopped believing him. It hurt too much to hope." Grace glanced at her. Hope's the only thing that ever changes anything. They reached Baton Rouge just after midnight. The courthouse was dark, but a clerk on duty took their statements, time-stamped the documents, and promised to hand them to the district attorney by morning. When Grace and Helen stepped back into the rain, it felt like the world had exhaled with them. "Do you think it's enough?" Helen asked. "It has to be," Grace whispered. "It's the truth." They drove back through the night in silence. When the sun rose, the swamp shimmered with mist. But as they neared St. Helena, Grace's phone buzzed. It was Ava. Her voice was tight, trembling. Grace, they're not stopping it. The appeal was rejected. They moved up the execution. Grace's hands went numb. When? Tonight. The road blurred through her tears. Helen clutched the folder to her chest, whispering, No. No, this can't be real. Grace pressed harder on the gas, the tires skidding through the mud. We still have time, she said, though she wasn't sure she believed it. By the time they reached the prison, night had fallen again. The gates were closed, the lights blazing white against the rain. Guards stood outside, grim and silent. Grace jumped out before the car stopped. You have to let me in, she shouted. There's new evidence. You can't do this. The officer at the gate didn't move. I'm sorry, ma'am. Orders came down an hour ago. It's done. Grace staggered back as Helen's cry broke the air behind her. She sank to her knees in the mud, the rain pouring down, her hands trembling so hard she couldn't feel them. Somewhere beyond those walls, the world had just ended for a man who never stopped believing that truth mattered. Helen knelt beside her, clutching Grace's arm. He was innocent, she sobbed, and we were too late. Grace couldn't speak. She could only stare at the steel gates as thunder rolled overhead. When the lightning flashed, she thought for a moment she saw his face reflected in the rain. A man calm, forgiving, free. And in that storm, surrounded by grief and guilt, Grace Turner made one silent vow. If justice had failed him, she would not. She would make the world see who Michael Reed really was, even if it was the last thing she ever did him. The next morning, the sun rose over St. Helena like nothing had happened. The swamp glistened gold, the air thick with the smell of wet earth and magnolia. But inside the prison, an emptiness hung heavier than the humidity. Grace Turner didn't sign in for duty that day. She couldn't. She sat in her car outside the gates, staring at the spot where she and Helen had fallen to their knees the night before. The mud had already dried, covering their footprints. The world, it seemed, moved on too quickly. Helen sat beside her, silent. Her eyes were red, but dry now. Her grief folded neatly into something colder, resolve. He's gone, she whispered, but I won't let them bury the truth with him. Grace nodded slowly. Neither will I. Ava called later that afternoon. Her voice was strained. Grace, you need to hear this. After the execution, someone leaked the recording of Harold Finch's confession. It's everywhere. State news, radio, even national sites. They're reopening the investigation into Dalton. Grace's breath caught. But it's too late for him. Ava hesitated. Maybe not for his name. That night, Grace walked through her house like a ghost. The lights were off, the air heavy with silence. On the kitchen table lay the folder she'd carried for weeks, the edges warped from rain and sweat. She picked it up, then saw something lying beneath it. A single photograph. It was the Polaroid she'd taken from Michael's Bible. Michael and Helen, young and smiling, sunlight catching the bayou behind them. She traced her thumb over his face and whispered, I'm sorry. The next morning, she went back to the prison to turn in her badge. The warden met her at the office door. I heard about the investigation, he said, his tone tight. You're lucky you weren't fired weeks ago. Internal Affairs wants to talk to you. But off the record, Turner, you did the right thing. Grace studied his face. For the first time, she saw something human in his eyes. She placed the badge on his desk and walked out, without looking back. Days passed, then weeks. Dalton's empire began to crumble. The factory was shut down for good, his assets frozen. He was arrested in Baton Rouge on charges of corruption, obstruction, and perjury. Every major paper in the state carried the headline, Businessman Behind Wrongful Conviction Exposed. Grace and Helen watched the news together, the glow of the television flickering over their tired faces. They'll never give him back what they took, Helen said softly. No, Grace replied. But maybe now they'll know what they did. Ava joined them later that evening with a printed newspaper in her hand. She laid it on the table. The front page showed Dalton in handcuffs. Beneath it, a smaller headline read, State to issue posthumous exoneration for Michael Reed. Helen covered her mouth, a sound between a sob and a laugh escaping her. Tears filled her eyes as she whispered, "He's free." They finally said it. Grace smiled faintly through her own tears. He was always free. The rest of the world just caught up. A few weeks later, Grace was called before a state committee. They wanted to question her role in the leaks, the investigation, the rules she'd broken. When they asked if she regretted her actions, she stood tall and answered, "I regret that it took me this long to see that following the rules isn't the same as doing what's right." The panel was silent. One of the older members, a retired judge, finally spoke. "Officer Turner, you disobeyed orders, violated protocols. But you also uncovered the truth. The department needs more people like you, not fewer." When Grace walked out of the courthouse, Helen and Ava were waiting. The three women stood together on the courthouse steps, the sun breaking through the clouds at last. That night, Grace drove alone to the edge of the swamp. The air was thick with the scent of honeysuckle and rain. Fireflies flickered in the distance like tiny sparks of hope. She walked to a small clearing where the grass grew wild and uneven. Someone, Helen, she guessed, had placed a simple wooden cross there, carved with the name Michael Reed. In front of it, a patch of bright yellow sunflowers swayed in the evening breeze, their faces turned toward the fading light. Grace knelt down and placed the old Polaroid beside them. "I kept my promise," she whispered. "You're safe now." And so is she. She stayed there a long time, watching the sun sink behind the cypress trees. The sky turned from gold to crimson, and the first stars began to appear. When she finally stood, she looked back once more at the sunflowers. They seemed to glow in the twilight, standing tall against the darkening swamp. In that moment, she understood something her father had once tried to teach her. That justice isn't always about punishment. Sometimes it's about remembering. And though Michael Reed was gone, his truth had finally taken root. As Grace walked back to her car, the cicadas started singing again, their voices rising into the warm Louisiana night. Soft, steady, eternal. Justice had come too late for one man, but because of him, it would come sooner for many others. Months passed, and the world began to forget. But not Grace Turner. Every morning, she still woke before dawn. She still drove the same cracked Louisiana road to St. Helena, not to the prison anymore, but to the small community center just a few miles away. That was where she worked now, helping families of inmates who couldn't afford lawyers, helping women who'd lost faith in the system the way she once had. Sometimes she'd look out the window at the swamp shimmering in the early light and remember the man who'd started it all, Michael Reed, the man who had nothing left but the truth and gave it to her to protect. One afternoon, as she sorted through case files, a soft knock came at the door. Helen Reed stood there, holding a box wrapped in brown paper. Her face looked older, but her eyes carried a quiet peace Grace hadn't seen before. "I thought you should have this," Helen said. "It came in the mail last week. The state finally released his personal effects." Inside the box was a folded prison uniform, a Bible worn thin at the corners, and one more letter, still sealed, addressed to Grace Turner in Michael's handwriting. Her throat tightened as she opened it. "Grace, if you're reading this, I guess time finally caught up with me. Don't let it catch you the same way. People like you, people who still believe in what's right, keep the rest of us from giving up. You did what no one else ever dared to do. You listened. I don't know if I'll ever see Helen again. But if you do, tell her she was my reason for breathing, even when I couldn't anymore. And tell her I forgive her. Because loving someone means letting them live without your shadow. Keep walking the line, Grace. Even if it breaks you sometimes, someone has to." Michael. The words blurred through her tears. She folded the letter back into its envelope and pressed it to her chest. Helen reached across the table, her hand trembling slightly. "He believed in you, Grace. You gave him back his voice." Grace smiled faintly. "He gave me something, too. He made me see what justice really means." A few weeks later, a public ceremony was held in Baton Rouge. The governor stood at the podium, flanked by reporters and cameras. Helen wore a simple blue dress. The same color Michael once said made her look like a bit of sky. When Grace stepped onto the stage beside her, the crowd fell silent. The governor cleared his throat. Today, the state of Louisiana officially clears the name of Michael Reed. We acknowledge that a grave mistake was made, and we honor those who fought to bring the truth to light. The audience applauded, slow at first, then louder, until the sound filled the square. Helen's tears fell freely. Grace squeezed her hand, the two women standing side by side beneath the bright southern sun. For the first time in years, Grace felt something close to peace. That evening, after the ceremony, Grace drove back to the swamp one last time. The air was warm, humming with life. The sunflowers near Michael's grave had grown taller, their faces turned toward the setting light. She placed the folded letter at the base of the wooden cross, next to the Polaroid she'd left months before. The photo was faded now, but the smiles were still there. Michael and Helen, frozen in a moment the world couldn't destroy. Grace knelt and whispered, "You were right, Michael. The truth doesn't travel fast, but it never stops moving." The wind stirred through the reeds, soft and steady, as if answering her. She stood and looked out across the bayou, the same place where she'd once felt small and powerless. Now, it felt sacred. A golden light shimmered on the water. The cicadas sang their song again, low and rhythmic, wrapping the evening in peace. Later that night, Grace sat by her window, the letter still fresh in her mind. She opened her notebook and began to write. Not a report this time, but a story. Michael's story. She wrote about the man who never gave up on the truth, the wife who found her courage too late, and the officer who learned that justice sometimes lives outside the law. Her words flowed steady and sure, like the river beyond the swamp. When she finished, she whispered the title aloud, "The Last Promise." Then she smiled, knowing it wasn't just his story anymore. It belonged to every person who'd ever been silenced, every woman who'd ever been told to stand down, every heart that still believed kindness could be stronger than fear. Outside, the swamp shimmered under the moonlight. And in that quiet Louisiana night, justice didn't feel like an institution anymore. It felt like faith. Faith in truth. Faith in redemption. Faith in the people brave enough to keep believing, even when the world stops listening.